Important notes about online learning. On the course page, you'll find a very useful document with some hints and tips on how to manage your data and to reduce your data consumption. Download the slides and go through them along with the video or audio, and please pay special attention to the lecture outcomes. The outcomes tell you what you need to be able to do in order to pass the assessment. This means that the outcomes define the scope of your assessment. You still need to make notes and try and express things in your own words, and this is going to be very important for your own understanding. You still need to go through the prescribed reading and do the exercises, and you still need to explore further through additional reading, online investigation. For instance, YouTube has some wonderful linguistic resources. Remember that your evidence of engagement will all be part of your portfolio. Every lecturer hopes that all students do these things anyway, but when you are doing online learning from home, the opportunities to do so are quite different. It becomes even more important that you do these things. You will need to manage your own time and take responsibility for your own learning. Hold tight and enjoy the lecture. Subject movement and the EPP. In this lecture, we're going to be asking and answering a number of questions about subjects, where they're from, and where they go. By the end of the lecture, I would like you to be able to draw tree diagrams incorporating inflection node and the cycle of merge, move, and agree. I would also like you to be able to outline the verb phrase internal subject hypothesis and apply theta roles to arguments. You should be able to name and explain what are the different features that play roles in syntactic derivations, and finally, to be aware of the existence of EPP and Prodrop languages, although a detailed discussion of these issues is not in the scope of this module. So in one of the previous lectures, we used floating quantifiers to develop the following kind of tree structure, and central to that was the idea that each head projects a specifier which can be filled by another phrase. I asked you to analyze these two sentences with particular focus on the implications for the auxiliary phrase and the verb phrase. The structure that you ought to have arrived at would be an auxiliary phrase with a specifier and a verb phrase with a specifier, which the quantifier raising data seems to show is filled by a subject at an early phase in the derivation, subsequent to which the noun phrase subject moves to the specifier of the inflection phrase, and it may or may not travel through intermediate specifiers along the way. Until now, we've been drawing our trees with subjects largely in the first position in the sentence. So it seems a little unintuitive that subjects somehow seem to start out in a much lower position in the sentence inside the verb phrase. And this raises a number of questions such as, does the subject start out in a low position and move upwards? Why does the subject start out in a low position? And why does the subject move to a higher position? And does the subject always need to move to a higher position? These are the questions that we are going to explore in the following lecture. So question 1, does the subject start out in a low position and move upwards? Well, the answer seems to be yes, because we have empirical evidence to that effect. If you look at the following quantifier float examples, in number 1, all the children is in the front of the sentence, and we now know this to be the specifier of the inflection phrase. However, if you look at 2, the children would have all carried the shopping bags, we see that the quantifier all, which scopes over the noun phrase the children, has been stranded just to the left of the verb carried, and this suggests that that is probably where the noun phrase must have originated, with the implication then that when the subject is in the first position in the sentence, that is a derived position, namely that's where the subject ended up and not where it started. Expletive constructions, also sometimes called existential constructions, show a similar kind of phenomenon. In number 3, we have an ordinary sentence where several children is in the front of the sentence in a position that we now know to be specifier of inflection phrase. However, if you look at 4, there were several children near the shops, we notice two interesting things. First of all, several children, which is the semantic subject of the sentence, occurs not in the specifier of the inflection phrase, but deeper down inside the sentence. The other thing that we notice is that in the subject position, a curious category seems to pop up, namely the word there. This is what we call the expletive, or an expletive subject. It's important to notice that number 3 and 4 are semantically equivalent, so it doesn't look as though the position of the subject or the insertion of the expletive there seems to have a large amount of semantic effect on these examples. It's also interesting that in number 4, the agreement on the verb were is clearly triggered by the semantic subject several children, and this is demonstrated by the contrast in 5 and 6. In number 5, there is several children near the shops is clearly an ungrammatical sentence, which shows that we need a plural agreement, and the plural agreement must be triggered by the noun phrase several children. In contrast, when you have a semantic subject like exactly one child, which is necessarily singular, we can see that the verb be is inflected in the singular, as shown in example 6. There is a lot that can be said about these kinds of constructions, and we are not actually going to attempt an analysis here. All I want you to be able to do at this point is to show how these kinds of constructions demonstrate that the subject seems to start out in a lower position inside the sentence, a position which incidentally seems to be consistent with a specifier of a verb phrase. This seems to be quite important for X-bar theory because X-bar theory predicts that every head must project a specifier, and the verb and verb phrase would be no exception. So X-bar theory predicts that there is a structural position where a subject could be inside the verb phrase. The fact that we have been able to find some empirical evidence that seems to support this prediction is therefore very important and supports the general idea of X-bar theory as something that we might want to pursue. Question 2. Why does the subject start out in a low position and move upwards? Well, it's all very well being able to say that empirically we can show that that is where the subject starts, but our theory needs to be able to explain why this might be the case. The solution to this might lie in something called the Theta criterion. The Theta criterion says that every noun phrase needs a theta role, and every theta role must be assigned. Theta roles, you will recall, are thematic roles or semantic roles in a sentence, namely who does what, who is the agent, who or what is the patient or beneficiary, who or what is the possessor or possessum, etc. Also, in previous lectures, we have talked a little bit about how different parts of the tree might communicate with each other and develop long-distance dependencies. And central to this is the idea of C command, which is also incorporated into the agree mechanism. So for now, let's say that theta roles are assigned by C command, perhaps mediated by agree. Let's look at the following tree to work out how this might happen. So the verb carry can C command its object, the shopping bags, and therefore it is quite likely that carry can assign a theta role to the noun phrase object. However, let's look at the subject noun phrase and the specifier of the inflection phrase and ask ourselves how we might be able to assign a theta role by C command and or agree. Obviously, if we start at the verbal head and project upwards, it would be absolutely impossible for the verbal head to be able to C command the specifier of inflection phrase. How about if we went to the highest node of the verb phrase and started our C command relationship from there? Even in that instance, we can see that there's no possible way for the verb, even calculated from its highest maximal projection, to be able to assign a theta role to the noun phrase. However, let's imagine that the noun phrase actually starts out in the specifier of the verb phrase, and that the verb assigns a theta role to the noun phrase, perhaps by an agree mechanism, and that the V bar level, which is itself just a projection of the verb, assigns a thematic role to the noun phrase subject, again by C command, which is incorporated into the agree mechanism. This provides a reasonable reason why our subjects might need to start out lower in the tree in order to obtain some kind of semantic interpretation. And this seems to be quite a welcome development because our theory about phrasal structure is slowly starting to be integrated with our theories about semantics, which starts to give our theories as a whole much more explanatory power. Question 3. Why does the subject move to a higher position? So having established that the subject starts out inside the specifier of the verb phrase for semantic reasons so that its theta roles can be assigned, the next question we might want to consider is why would the subject need to move to a higher position at all? Why couldn't it just stay in its base position inside the specifier of the verb phrase? So let's look at our structure that we've been developing over the past lecture or two. And once the verb has assigned a theta roles inside the verb phrase, what would cause the subject to move to another kind of position? Well, one possible answer could be that the subject moves to the specifier specifier of the inflection phrase so that it can participate in the inflectional process. We note, for example, that in many languages, the finite verb is often inflected with morphological features denoting person, number, and gender if the language has that, while the subject noun phrase tends to be inflected for nominative case. So perhaps it is an interaction of the mutual needs of these categories that motivates the movement. So the subject noun phrase needs to have its case features checked, while the inflectional node needs to check its phi features. In the previous lecture, we talked a little bit about the agreement mechanism, which checks these types of features, and so we might imagine that uninterpretable phi features probe through the structure looking for equivalent interpretable phi features. They discover these on the noun phrase subject, and features are checked. Thereafter, the subject noun phrase moves to the specifier of the inflection phrase, and its uninterpretable case feature probes the structure looking for an equivalent interpretable case feature, which it finds on the inflectional node, and agreement proceeds, thus checking off those features. This would seem to be a reasonable explanation for two important properties of subjects. First of all, they have semantic properties such as agent, which is assigned inside the verb phrase, and secondly, subjects seem to trigger agreement on the inflection node. And this leads us to question 4. Does the subject always move to a higher position? Based on our understanding up to this point, it would be quite reasonable to suggest that yes, the subject does always need to move to a higher position because it will always need to check inflection features. The exception, of course, might be infinitives, where by definition there are no inflectional features to check. However, reality is rarely that convenient, and the answer seems to be no. Let's look at some examples. Example 1 shows us that a noun phrase subject can be in specifier of IP in that construction. The fact is that rats are very intelligent. However, it is also possible to rephrase number 1 as number 2. It is a fact that rats are very intelligent, and we will notice that 1 and 2 seem to be semantically equivalent. However, it is noticeable in this example that the noun phrase a fact does not occur in the specifier of the inflection phrase, but rather in a position within the sentence, probably a specifier of the verb phrase. Instead, we have a semantically meaningless expletive category, namely it, which seems to be occupying the specifier of the inflection phrase, and which is also actually triggering agreement on the verb. Example 4 shows another kind of expletive sentence, which we've already encountered in this lecture. There were several rats snoozing near the cat. And as I mentioned earlier, several rats, the semantic subject, appears in the specifier of the verb phrase within the sentence and not in the specifier of the inflection phrase in the first position. Instead, what we see is a meaningless expletive subject, namely there, which occurs in the specifier of the inflection phrase. So this seems to demonstrate quite strongly that subject-noun phrases do not always move to the specifier of the inflection phrase, but on the other hand, there must always be something in this specifier of the inflection phrase. So the spec IP seems to be quite a special projection in English, insofar as it must always be filled by some category or other, even if that category is semantically meaningless. So let's go ahead and give this special property of the specifier of IP a name, and let's call it EPP, because that is the name that's been applied in the literature. It's important to note, however, that although English and many other languages require overt subjects, this is not the case for every language. There is a special category of languages called Prodrop languages, where the subject can be left implicit. In other words, we don't need to have an overtly visible subject, and in these languages, expletive constructions tend to be absent. This example from Arabic shows us that the semantic subject you in the first clause and he in the second clause is absent. I've marked the absent categories red in the transliteration to assist. Similarly, in Turkish, if you want to say I saw you, you wouldn't need to explicitly say I. You could get away with saying something like saw you. And a very similar process occurs in Portuguese, where if you wanted to say, do you see this log? You wouldn't need to express the you pronoun overtly, and you could just say, to see this log, with the semantic subject being left implicit. This phenomenon is called prodrop, where the subject tends to be dropped out of sentences and not expressed overtly. Although every speaker will be able to tell you that semantically the subject is there, it is just implicit. So summing up, there is something very special about the specifier of the inflection phrase that is mysterious. It seems to always need to be filled in languages like English, even if that item that fills it is semantically empty. We don't fully understand this property yet, so let's acknowledge the mysterious, unexplained nature of this issue by inserting a feature called EPP, which stands for the Extended Projection Principle. This feature contains some instructions to the grammar to the effect that this specifier needs to be filled by an overtly spelled out constituent, such as the noun phrase subject. The EPP and its nature is a stipulation, and stipulations are usually not good for scientific theories. And for this reason, the EPP has attracted a huge amount of research interest over the past 20 years. For instance, Saito talked about Japanese in 1989, Alexiadou and Anagnostopoulou compared Greek and Arabic in 1999. McCloskey applied these insights to Irish, which is a verb-first language, and Carstens explored the interrelationship of agreement and the EPP in African languages from the Bantu language group. So let's end off by taking everything that we've learned and uncovered in the past few lectures and applying it in building up a syntactic tree. As we develop this structure, we are also going to apply the derivational cycle of merge, agree, and then move. So we would start off by selecting a number of features from our lexicon and putting them into enumeration, which is a fancy word for a little box of features. And these features might include some nominal features, a couple of verbs, some auxiliaries, some 5 features, etc. And this numeration, consisting of these features and categories, is like a little basket of Lego parts that we will use to subsequently build our derivation. So we start off with the verb, which projects a verb phrase, etc. And we check its features. It requires that it be merged with an object. So having already built an object in a very similar way, we merge that object into the complement of the verb carry. The noun phrase requires a theta role, and the verb has a theta role to offer, so the verb applies a theta role to the noun phrase, probably in an agreement process. At this point, there is no movement that needs to apply, and so the cycle starts again with merging a noun phrase into the specifier of the verb phrase. Agreement applies a theta role to the noun phrase, and at this point, no movement can apply because there are no further projections to move to. The cycle starts once more with merging a prepositional phrase as an adjunct to the verb phrase. There is no agreement that will happen between the prepositional phrase and anything else in the structure, although it is important to know that inside the prepositional phrase, prior to this, the preposition will assign case and a theta role to that noun phrase. There's no movement that needs to apply, and so our cycle starts again. We merge an auxiliary have. In terms of agree, at this point, there's still nothing that can check the uninterpretable case features on our noun phrase, and no movement needs to apply. The cycle continues with merging the inflectional phrase, which includes a number of features, including uninterpretable 5 features, tense, and an EPP feature. With merge complete, agreement is free to apply. The uninterpretable 5 features probe for their interpretable counterparts. They find them on the subject noun phrase, and the process of agreement checks those uninterpretable features and provides them with some values. In this case, third person plural. With the agreement process complete, movement can apply. There is an EPP feature which motivates movement of the subject noun phrase to the specifier of the inflectional phrase, and the process starts all over again. There's nothing new to merge at this point. Agree occurs when the uninterpretable case feature on the noun phrase probes for its interpretable counterpart, which it finds in the feature bundle in the head of the inflection node. Agreement proceeds to provide a value. The uninterpretable feature is deleted and replaced with a valued counterpart, namely nominative case. At this point, all uninterpretable features in the derivation have been removed. Everything that needs to move has moved, and there's nothing further to merge. So we would say that the derivation is complete, and this tree structure is then handed off to the interfaces. The interfaces consist of 2 parts. On the one hand, we have the PF, or phonological form interface, and that interface in the mind takes this complicated tree and sends it to the morphology and makes sure that the tree is spelled out in a way that is pronounceable, ultimately yielding a string of words that we can pronounce or write down. The other interface is called LF, or logical form, and what logical form does is take this tree structure and interprets it semantically, ultimately feeding it into the parts of the brain and the mind that require meaning. In this way, we have developed a complex sign, or a sentence, which has both a physical manifestation as a phonological pronounceable form, which is also paired with some kind of a semantic meaning. To conclude, we started out with 4 questions that we wanted answers to. Does the subject start out in a low position and move upwards? The answer is yes. We can demonstrate empirically that subjects originate inside the verb phrase. Question 2. Why does the subject start out in a low verb phrase internal position? And the reason seems to be that the subject needs to have its thematic role assigned inside that position. And this allows the integration of our semantic theta theory and our theories of tree structure. Question 3. Why does the subject move to a higher position? And there are 2 tentative answers to this. The first is that the subject moves in order to check its features, and the second part of that answer is that it moves in order to check the EPP. However, since we do not really fully understand the EPP, it also means that we do not completely understand the reasons why subjects move to a higher position. And this is compounded by the answer to question 4. Does the subject always move to a higher position? And the answer seems to be no. In a language like English or a similar EPP language, a subject may remain inside the verb phrase if and only if the subject position in the specifier of the inflection phrase is filled by some other category, such as a semantically meaningless expletive. However, in non-EPP languages, the subject can also remain in situ inside the specifier of the verb phrase. And in these non-EPP languages, the specifier of the inflection phrase does not need to be filled at all, not even by a semantically meaningless item. So taking all this together, you should now have sufficient theory and expertise to be able to draw trees for many simple sentence structures in English. The theory that we've accumulated so far is also sufficient to allow us to start making tentative hypotheses about other grammatical phenomena, both in English and in many other languages that we are familiar with.